Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating idea. What if the pandemic didn't actually create a new world? What if it just slammed its foot on the gas pedal of the world that was already coming? We're going to explore that idea by looking at how this great acceleration totally reshaped China's economy. So we'll break this down into 4 key areas. First, we'll look at the Great Acceleration itself. Then, we'll see how that sped up the creation of a more digital and domestic China. After that, we'll explore what that meant for businesses in a trend called survival of the agile. And finally, we'll see how it forged a completely new consumer mindset. All right, so let's jump right into the single biggest idea in this whole analysis. It's a concept that really challenges how most of us have been thinking about the pandemic's economic impact. You know, we've all heard that phrase, the new normal. It kind of suggests that everything was just reset from scratch, right? Like the old rules got tossed out the window and we all had to start a brand new game. But what if that's not what happened at all? And you can see why that idea is so appealing. I mean, it certainly felt like the entire world changed overnight. It felt like totally new ways of living and working were just created out of thin air. But here's a much more powerful idea. The report argues that the pandemic wasn't an inventor, it was an accelerator. It acted like an irreversible wedge, taking trends that were already happening and driving them forward so hard and so fast that there was no going back. In other words, the future didn't change, it just arrived way ahead of schedule. And you can literally see this acceleration in the economic data. After this historic drop in early 2020, we're talking the first negative growth in decades, the economy didn't just recover, it snapped back with incredible speed. Now, this wasn't some kind of miracle. It was fueled by the country's pre-existing strengths, especially its digital infrastructure, which was suddenly supercharged by the crisis. So how did this acceleration actually play out on the ground? Well, it showed up in a huge way across 2 massive, interconnected trends, the big shift to digital and a growing focus on the domestic economy. Now, to really get this, you have to realize that China was already a digital retail giant long before the pandemic. I mean, look at this. Almost a quarter of all retail sales were happening online. That's more than double the US and Germany. The digital engine was already built and humming. The pandemic just floored the gas pedal. And here's where you see that acceleration just go wild. Services that were kind of niche, like online doctor visits or taking virtual reality tours of apartments, they suddenly became essential. Big brands like Nike saw their digital sales surge through their training apps. And business tools like DingTalk just exploded, becoming indispensable for millions of people forced to work from home seemingly overnight. But this incredibly strong digital ecosystem did something else too. It fueled another major trend that was already underway. China was increasingly turning inward, becoming less and less reliant on the rest of the world. And the numbers here are pretty striking. In just over a decade, trade's contribution to the economy absolutely plummeted. The percentage of things like PCs being made for export got cut in half. China was already well on its way to becoming its own biggest customer. The pandemic, with all the chaos and global supply chains, basically just slammed the door shut and locked in that trend. Okay, so when you have this much change this fast, it creates immense pressure. And that sparks our third accelerated trend, a really fierce battle for survival where being agile became the only thing that mattered, especially in a market that was already tilted towards the biggest players. So even before 2020, China's economy was already incredibly top-heavy. The top 10% of companies were raking in a staggering 90% of all the profits. Think about that. The game was already skewed towards the giants. And here is the twist. You know, we often think of big corporations as slow-moving elephants, right? But the report describes China's giants as agile tigers. And during the crisis, man, they really proved just how fast they could move. These companies didn't just survive, they completely adapted and thrived. A cosmetics brand, Perfect Diary, saw its stores close, so they retrained all their salespeople to become live streamers, and they became a top seller online. Alibaba's Hema supermarket hired restaurant workers who were suddenly jobless to meet the insane demand for grocery delivery. And ByteDance, they went on a massive hiring spree to capitalize on everyone being stuck at home on their phones. They totally rethought their operations, practically overnight. But for the smaller, less agile companies, it was a brutal story. A staggering 60% said they had less than 3 months of cash to survive. So the pandemic didn't create that gap between the big and the small, but it sure widened it into a massive chasm. accelerating that divide between the agile tigers and everybody else. Now, this intense pressure on businesses was mirrored by a really profound shift in people. And that brings us to our final accelerated trend, a huge change in the consumer mindset, changing what people value and, of course, how they spend their money. For a whole lot of younger Chinese people, the pandemic was the very first major economic downturn they'd ever experienced in their lives. And that shock led to a sharp turn toward being more careful with money, with 42% of those in their 20s and 30s saying they plan to save more. But, and you can probably guess what's coming, this sudden new caution wasn't a brand new behavior. Nope. It was the acceleration of a way of thinking that was already being shaped by the youngest generation of consumers, Gen Z. There's this fascinating concept called the Buddha-like generation. It was a term used before the pandemic to describe young people who, because they grew up with a lot of abundance, were already becoming less interested in just buying stuff for the sake of it. They were already shifting their focus from buying more to buying better, buying what they really needed and what they truly valued. And this really shows you what their priorities were. This mindset was already leading to less interest in things like fast fashion and cars among the young. Instead, they were more interested in self-improvement, learning, and global issues like the environment. They were already questioning consumerism long before the pandemic forced everyone else to do the same. So what the crisis did was it essentially took these Buddha-like values from Gen Z, being careful with money, valuing self-improvement, caring about social issues, and it blasted them across all age groups. Suddenly, everybody, not just the young, was reevaluating what truly matters. It just fast-forwarded a major societal shift. And that really is the core idea of this whole explainer. This framework of acceleration, not invention, is the key to making sense of our post-pandemic world, not just in China, but everywhere. The future didn't come out of nowhere. It was just a supercharged version of what was already here. And really, this isn't just a story about China. It's a mental model that we can all use to understand the changes happening all around us. So think about it. From remote work to online shopping to how we value our time, what existing trends suddenly hit warp speed in your community? Thank you for joining this explainer.